So we have a few good questions, and I think the teachers are really taken with just the stats that you provided in terms of how much money is being provided to uh, Indian tribes for land and then being resold for $1 an acre. And we caught the 7 cents an acre for in the Washington Treaty. And is that pretty normal? Is that kind of the ballpark figure that was paid out?
Yeah, so one of the things I didn't get one of the things I didn't get to as I sped through this. Let me real quick with this. It is totally the normal, totally the normal process. So this, this is the Wisconsin, the 1837 for the next year. This is something in the neighborhood of 11 million acres. I think it comes out to 11 cents an acre. So this treaty process, and it's the same kind of thing where that treaty payment is something in the neighborhood of, again, around $40,000. But out of the $40,000, usually less than 10% makes it to the native people. The rest is claimed because merchants, all people who are in Wisconsin territory, claim it as debt. And so every time, and this is important because in this time period, there's often a shortage of species. So this is cash money circulating in the economy, and that cash money is what merchants use to sort of build up the infrastructure of their businesses, to finance their business, basically. But that also is important in the sense too that rate at which, if you can get land at $1 an acre, that's pretty inexpensive compared to land in the South, which is usually gone through sort of multiple agents by the time individuals buy it. So it's a pretty subsidized land base.
Yeah, absolutely. And we had a series of comments about the treaties, and I guess putting those comments together, I guess the question might be almost what's more criminal, the treaties themselves, the original treaties themselves, or the United States not honoring the treaties? And I guess maybe the answer is both, but can you talk a little bit about that and how the government maybe to this day either follows through or doesn't follow through on some of those early treaties?
Sure. I mean, a couple of things as I blew through I gave myself way too much for 40 minutes, but as I blew through that.
I did too yesterday, don't worry.
So I think this is super important to think about. Now, if you guys, I'm trying to think about what transfers into what you as teachers think about versus what you give to your students, particularly at junior high school. But so these treaties that I just mentioned, the two that I had up there briefly, the Washington Treaty of 1836, the St. Peter's Treaty of 1837, those were both treaties that extinguished title to somewhere like between, in both cases, 10 million plus acres of land. Both those things not only generated massive amounts of revenue, and it's not just the revenue that goes to pay for that, but part of the annuity payment is also the provision, usually about, in addition to that $40,000, $10,000 in goods and services. So the same merchants who were claiming debt, they also supply those goods and services to the government. So they're kind of double dipping in that sense. So they're making extra money on that end. And then the other thing that's happening is that actually this extinction of title to land in these vast tracts of territory that I mentioned, it doesn't make a lot of sense even in the 1830s to settle in northern Wisconsin because it's pretty far removed. And what does begin to make sense much later in the 19th century is you can use that land for timbering. So a lot of that land is in the public domain before there's a desire for it. And a lot of that land sits in the public domain and ends up being purchased or used by the federal government when they create land-grant colleges. So the Morrill Act, which created all the land-grant colleges around 1865, I think, in all the states in the Union. What the Morrill Act did was it took land in the public domain that were, essentially this was land that where native title had been extinguished, turned it into land scripts, so financial instruments, and then gave those land scripts to the various states who would then give it to their land-grant colleges. For the most part, those land-grant colleges would then sell that land script on the open market and take the cash and make that as the financial basis for their endowment. But in some cases, it took the land script and turned it into private property and held onto it as property for a period of time, and then sold it later so they could make money for it. Cornell University, the vast majority of its endowment comes from these two treaties, where this public land enters the public domain is purchased or is given by as land scrip to Ezra Cornell, who then takes that land, invests himself in it, turns it into private property, holds onto it Cornell for another 20 years, and then sells it at something like $10, $20 an acre from the original 7 cents an acre, and just makes enough money for an endowment. And this is not just exclusive to Cornell. All the land grant colleges have these similar grants of land. So essentially, this is a major public good that the United States has created, a public good like railroads, that's created by basically taking indigenous land and transferring it to the general citizenry or the population. And there's been no compensation for it, really.
Yeah, well, that's so important because, I mean, as you know well, the issue of slavery and endowments has, been in the news and been a big issue. And it seems like this issue of native lands and being the foundation of so many colleges and universities hasn't gotten the publicity maybe that it deserves. Would you agree with that?
I would. One of the things, again, this is a tight framework. One of the things that's really fascinating to me about the Northwest Ordinance, which is thought of as the way that northern free states expand. And as I mentioned at the beginning, this is the free soil movement is very much attached to this idea that there's this free land out there, the native land is free land, and that this is a prerequisite for a republic. But these free states and free territories are very much linked to the South and slavery expansion in the South, because each free state has to have a fugitive slave clause. A fugitive slave clause in their constitution. But not only that, every single state, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, every single one of those states enacts black laws that are designed to prohibit free blacks from migrating. So in every one of those states that I mentioned, they pass laws that if you are a free black immigrating to the state, you need to provide proof that you are free, that you're not an escaped slave, to the county clerk or the justice of the peace of the county where you settle. Then you have to post a bond. In some cases, as little as $500, but in some cases up to $1,500, which in 19th century money is a lot. So you post a bond as a free black person, which sort of testifies to the fact that you're free and black with the county. So it's designed essentially to make it cost prohibitive for a free black person to immigrate into these ostensibly free states and participate in this sort of kind of bonanza of making land available. So the restriction of black movement and migration tied to the sort of the restriction or protection of black enslaved people as property in the South and that expansion, these things are all interconnected for sure. And you can't really disentangle them. Even in a free state like the North, you see these instances where policies in and around policing black immigrants and policing enslaved black peoples are very much part of the same policy as extinguishing title and making it available for sale to white immigrants.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have some questions that I think are kind of anticipating the documents a little bit, getting into the issue of Jefferson's Indian policy. So maybe we'll hold that. And there's a lot of interest in the process that you've described in terms of indebtedness and pushing Indians into debt. And maybe just a question to end, and we'll go into our break, is what was the native access to the courts, and did they have any success in using United States courts to defend themselves in this process?
So I'll try to be succinct. This is really complicated. The short answer is no. No access to courts. You can't testify. If you're Native, you can't testify in court. Keep in mind, one of the other things that's going on here, Native people aren't citizens until in 1920 something. My grandmother was born in 1920. Redcliffe Ojibwe wasn't a citizen, even though my family has been here for millennia. So Native people aren't citizens in the early republic. Therefore, they can't testify in court. They can't serve on a jury. So they can't have access to courts at all. But the other thing that's going on here is that the sort of fleecing of Native North America and the sort of this process is being conducted in part with the mixed race natives relatives. So these are the people who are involved in the fur trade, and that the federal government is relying on these people to sort of facilitate this transfer because they need them to help negotiate, pressure them. And part of what's happening is these mixed race people who are interconnected, there's two things. One, they need to cash out of the fur trade because as Ohio becomes Ohio, you can't really conduct the fur trade anymore. But then two, people who aren't necessarily just malevolent are also desperately trying to figure out how to preserve themselves as mixed race people, but also their native relatives, because they see that their world is closing up and they need to secure, they want to secure reservations. They want to secure a place in their homeland. And the bargain they're making is they're giving away the vast amount of their territory and wealth in order to avoid removal, which they can see has been disastrous, because as this is happening in real time, they've seen Creek removal, Cherokee removal. So it's partly a devil with a bargain. There's also a lot of really bad actors who are selling out their own families, but there's definitely this way in which the sort of infrastructure around the fur trade becomes implicated with Indian business, which is the business of treaty making, and they're all sort of selling out this. And then Native people, so I saw people asking, not only can you not testify in court, but basically the way this process works is that you're on a reservation and your access to that annuity payment, however little it is, comes to that Indian agent who's appointed by the federal government. And if that agent is pissed off at you, guess what? You don't get your portion of the annuity. And this will persist into the 20th century. That Indian agent provides commodity foods that are given to supplement Native people's diets, especially when their political economies are compromised. That Indian agent determines who goes to a boarding school, who doesn't go to boarding school. I mean, so all those different things. It's a very
Yeah.